All right, well, I think we will go ahead and begin. And just looking down the list here, I'm wondering if Brother Zampan Leon, if you would be willing to pray with us or pray for us to open our class in just a minute or two. So if you're able to connect at that point, then we'll look forward to hearing from you in a second. I'm going to introduce Dr. Patterson, and then I'll just give him a brief overview of the other people that we are looking at across that have tuned in today. So Dr. Patterson, a couple of people that are here with us today. Pastor Halarsis is a graduate of BJMBC, and now he pastors in Southern Mindanao. Some challenges there, practically speaking, and just saw his last prayer update. Really amazing things too that the Lord is doing. Brother Andrew Seat, as well as Brother Gerard Them, as well as Brother Kenneth, each of them ministering at JSM, Jesus Saves Mission. Actually, another relationship there is Brother Joseph Ng, who's not there, but is related and familiar with this ministry there, as well as Sister Fei Mi. So each one of these people that are tuning in, connected with that ministry and those relationships there. I had the privilege of getting to know them just a little bit on our last term, and so really enjoyed that very much. Good group of people. Praise the Lord for them. And then we have a number of people that will also be watching the video afterwards. I just got a message from one of our men in Myanmar, and just because of some details with his family and so forth, he's not able to tune in. Dr. K usually is able to tune in. But with BJMBC starting up and so forth, as well as some other brothers of ours in Mexico, Poland, a couple of other places. And so where they're able to, in the UK, where they're able to catch it later on by video, that's what they end up doing. Brother Clay Gibbons just tuned in. So there's a representative from the UK. Let me introduce Dr. Patterson to all of you here. So Dr. Patterson got a PhD in New Testament theology, or New Testament interpretation, excuse me, at BJU, and graduated, I believe, the same year or around the same time as my pastor in Greenville, South Carolina. Since then, the Lord used him for, I believe, 18 years. Is that correct? Let me get the number. In Japan. If you are friends with him on Facebook, or actually, I guess it wasn't him, it was Yoshirado. There was a video that went up maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was Dr. Patterson leading a funeral in Japanese, and it was delightful to me to hear it. Just you know a person on one level, and then to hear them in another language, it's exciting to watch. But anyway, he ministered there, and the Lord used him for quite a number of years, and the Lord brought them back here. Back to the U.S. And so they served in the U.S. They have served now in the U.S. for, I'm going to guess, maybe 15 years. Does that sound right?
It's 16 as of March, yeah.
Okay.
16, yeah.
He teaches in the missions department, teaches classes for the missions classes at BJU, and then also has a significant leadership role at the mission that I'm under, Gospel Fellowship Association. So he, as a result of that, travels all over the world, sees ministries all over the world, and very much a good finger on the pulse of missions in the U.S. and worldwide. So that's part of the background for the lectures that we'll hear tonight, next time, and then later on in a couple of months, we'll hear one more lecture. A couple of weeks, we'll hear another lecture that's connected to missions, a missions-related topic as well. I want to give one note here. Our other lectures are mostly connected into the early period at this point. Coming up next time, we'll start into the medieval era and then the Reformation era. Well, obviously, clearly, this is jumping out of chronological order. And that just has to do with Dr. Patterson's schedule and how the details worked out. So anyway, just so you know, otherwise, we're kind of progressing through the early patristic era up through the medieval era. But this will be kind of a little excursus. We'll step out chronologically for a little bit. Okay, Brother Zamtan Leon, I will open up your microphone here, and except it looks like you beat me to it. So I would like to, let's go ahead and begin. And if you can pray for us, then we will jump straight into the class.
Yes. Let's pray. Father God, we are so thankful and grateful for the Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for the salvation that we received by faith through grace. So, Father, and thank you so much for the class that we are going to begin. Father, and we just want to thank you for the professors and all the students. Today, Father, and help us, Lord, and as we look into your wonderful missions that carried by the great people like William Carey to the India and many places in the few weeks, Father, and help us to understand more about your great plan. So, Father, and thank you so much, and we just ask your help. May your Holy Spirit guide us and lead us so that all things that we are learning and doing things will go for your glory. So we asked all these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Brother Zemthan Leon, I need to just insert here my sincere apologies. I did not mean to neglect you. So Brother Zemthan Leon serving in Myanmar and very involved in education and other aspects of ministry, and been with us for these classes as we proceeded along. Really enjoyed having his presence in these classes. Okay, Dr. Patterson.
Well, it's good to be able to talk to you about, excuse me, the history of missions. And it is appropriate that many of you who are listening in are in Asia and in areas that were the focus of these missionaries, especially William Carey and Adoniram Judson. Today's discussion will be about William Carey. And as Joel Arnold mentioned, the time frame might be a little bit out of sequence for you, but I think you'll be able to put it all in their proper order. I wanted to start chronologically for the 3 sessions that I will be doing. So we'll start with William Carey. Not too long after him is Adoniram Judson. And so I'm calling that the American roots. And then we will look at the student volunteer movement, which continues to have an impact upon us. You might not know about that, but it does affect all of us, especially through the World Council of Churches. So today we will be looking at the British roots, the history of missions, and with a special focus on William Carey, who is a wonderful study, a humble man, but a very gifted man. So the first thing to think about is the significance of William Carey. Why is he worth studying today? What's his significance? And I thought a couple of quotes might help us put it in perspective. I got these from one of the publications of William Carey's Inquiry. I'm not sure which one you read. I'm not sure which one Dr. Arnold gave to you. But this one is was published about 30 years ago by Criswell College. You might know the name Page Patterson. More recently, he's been at Southeastern and different places. But there's a foreword and an explanation about Carey, and in that foreword it says this: you know that last year was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, and when you think of that, you typically think of Martin Luther. Well, this is what he says regarding Luther and Carey. What Luther was to the Protestant Reformation, Carey was to the Christian missionary movement. And I think that's an accurate statement. We put a big emphasis on Martin Luther, and rightly so, but he's not the only actor in the Protestant Reformation. And of course, Carey is not the only actor in the missionary movement. There were men before him, and he references them in his inquiry. So we will talk a bit about some of those who had an impact upon him and who continue to have an impact upon us all. One other quote that will help lead us into our discussion: Carey's inquiry may have been the most convincing missionary appeal ever penned. That's a strong statement, deserving a place alongside Luther's 95 Theses. And I think, again, that's an accurate statement. I don't know of any other missionary appeal that has had such an impact, not only upon us, but upon the generations before us, and no doubt the generations after us. So I put it this way: the impetus for the modern missionary movement, and I would focus on modern, in that we're not talking about medieval times, we're not talking about apostolic times, we're not talking about the Dark Ages, but we're talking about the man who is considered the father of modern missions. By the way, Dr. Arnold, is there a way for people to ask questions as we go through?
Yes, sir, there is.
Okay, so if they want to do that, how do they do that?
What I'm just keeping my eye on the chat, and so as someone has a question in the chat, I'll bring that up with you.
Okay, so to those of you listening, if you do have a question, feel free to interject that question at any time. So there are two aspects to this. I'm calling it a booklet and a sermon. Now, if you looked at the inquiry, it probably had the original title, which is rather long. In fact, what you're seeing on the screen is not even the full title for the inquiry. But using the old spelling, the title was this: An Inquiry into the Obligation. That word obligation is critical for us, because that was something that the other believers of that time generally did not feel toward the heathens, as it's called here, to use means for the conversion of the heathens. So you have this booklet, and if you remember, it has 5 parts, and I've given my own definition of those parts. The first part is really the justification for missionary activity. I'd like to ask a question of you. I hope you had time to read through the inquiry. What was the thinking of the men of Carey's day regarding justification, or the lack of it, for missionary activity? Why did Carey feel a need to justify missionary activity? That seems pretty much a given for us. What was the problem in his day? We'll discuss this a little more, but just quickly, anybody?
And if, as you have an answer, let's just put that directly into the chat.
Okay.
Did not get to the reading. It, of course, is where you expect it to be in the Dropbox and the resources folder, and you can get through the Moodle page, or you can get through the Dropbox link I've given you. Just some comments from myself, Dr. Patterson, reading through this. You'd say about this being one of the most compelling cases for missions. I felt very much compelled, powerfully, reading through this. And that's in a context of a day where I grew up assuming that missions is a thing we need to do, versus Carey's situation where it's assumed as not a necessary thing. Could you comment, as other people, some are putting in their answers here in the chat, could you comment also specifically, I'd like us to hear about the way people viewed the Great Commission during this era. And that, of course, comes up in the reading here as well. But I'll hand it back over to you. We have 2 answers and others that will be coming in the chat.
Okay. Right. Well, we will touch on this, so this will be repeated, but I think it's good for us to to reiterate at times. The thinking of the men of that day, especially Carey's group, was what we would call today a hyper-Calvinistic view, which meant that God would save the heathen in his way and in his time, and it did not depend upon human effort so much as it was simply a work of God. There was also, and I don't want to give away the answer before reading some of the chat answers, but they had a view about the Great Commission. And so I guess what I'm looking for from some of you is, what was their view about the Great Commission? Joel, I appreciated your comment that reading through the inquiry is something that we would all say, I think we all would say amen to. It's a given in our thinking today, but we have to go back and think of the context in which he was giving this, even though, as you said, it stirs us today. I mean, what he says, and I'm going to read from it a couple of times, have some quotes from it, is compelling. I mean, you really can't argue with it. So a lot of it had to do, though, with their hyper-Calvinistic views of their responsibility, and that had to do with their understanding of the Great Commission. So we probably need to move on. Is there any, I'm not seeing those chat answers, so I'm not sure if there's anything there.
I'm happy to just read off the ones that we have here.
Okay.
Brother Xanthan Leon comment, next. Brother Clay Gibbons, they thought it only applied to the apostles. So
okay.
Brother Xanthan Leon, many have left out in many parts of the world. Pastor Denny Hilarsis, all people are prone to commit sin, the assumption that everybody's prone to commit sin. Therefore, it's not necessary. Brother Kenneth, they thought there were enough unevangelized in their own home soil. Brother Xanthan Leon, they found the great need for multitudes of people in remote areas. Brother Dr. Phil Kamabayashiyama questioned whether the Great Commission applied to them. Also felt that there were already a lot of needy near them. Myself, they felt that it was implausible, too hard, too dangerous, something that we should wait for God's initiative to bring it out. And Brother Kenneth, their view of the Great Commission was that it was the duty of the apostles, did not transfer to future generations.
Excellent. Very good. Yes, all of those I think are right on target. The simple explanation is they did not believe the Great Commission applied to them. That was for the apostles, as I think several of them pointed out. There's also the argument, and we hear this one, there's a lot that needs to be done locally, so why should we go, to a far country when there's so much that needs to be done in Carey's day in England? And Carey answered those objections, and we will get to those. But so very good answers. The theological justification for missionary activity is that the Great Commission does apply. He points out that if it doesn't apply to us, then some of those who've already been missionaries were running without a call. He points out that the promise that we rely upon, that Jesus is always with us, doesn't apply to us. If the command doesn't apply, the promise doesn't apply. So he answers those objections. So very good. Number two, he does a history of missions. And this is a very accurate history. The problem we run into in the history of missions is the period after around 200, maybe 300. After that, we're pretty much in a dark period, spiritually as well as historically. We just don't have a lot of information. We know that the Catholic Church was active, but that was a defective gospel for the most part, as far as we can tell. So he talks about the history of missions, but he does mention a couple of men that we need to talk about because they had an impact on Carey. Does anyone know who those two men were? One was an American and one was a British man. But he mentions these two. I don't know if you picked up on it, but they have an impact upon us. One of them still has his journal and his diary published even in our day 300 years later. Anybody know who that would be? Well, rather than wait for you to send a chat answer, let me give you those two men, because we will talk about them some more, especially when we get to Adoniram Judson. Those two men are John Eliot, and you may not know that name, but you need to get to know that name, and David Brainerd. You're more likely to know him because he was a friend of Jonathan Edwards. So those men were missionaries. John Eliot, a missionary to the American Indians back in the 1600s, not very long after the Pilgrims landed in America. John Eliot came about 13 years later, 1632 or 3. And he evangelized the Indians in America. He translated the Bible into their language. And he had an impact on William Carey. And then David Brainerd had an impact as well. He too evangelized the American Indians. The thing about him is that Edwards published his diary and his journal, and it's still being republished, which tells you something about its impact. So he talks about the history of missions. Then the third part, really, given the fact that he did not have databases like we do, it's a remarkable tabulation of information about every country in the world that he knew of. And we'll talk more about that in a little while. And then he talks about objections answered. I thought this one was really helpful. And some of the objections, I'm just going to point these out from the book. The first objection has to do with distance. How can we expect to reach people who are on the other side of the world? And his argument is, well, the commercial enterprises do it. And if they can do it, we certainly ought to be able to take the gospel to the world. So distance, he says, is not really an issue. What about way of life? These people are uncivilized. They have a barbarous way of living. Well, Carey puts it this way. He cuts right to the quick. He says, this should not be an objection except to those whose love of ease renders them unwilling to expose themselves to inconveniences for the good of others. Ouch. That's not an objection unless you're unwilling to inconvenience yourself for the good of others. And again, he points out this is not an objection to commercial men. And so objection 2 really has no merit. Objection 3 has to do with danger. He says we might be killed if we go to these places. And if you remember, his answer to that is Paul and Barnabas. He quotes Acts 15:26. Paul and Barnabas hazarded their lives for the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he says they were not blamed for being rash. They were commended for so doing. So that objection he answers. The fourth objection has to do with getting the necessities of life. How can we get food and clothing that we need, as he mentions Europeans? And he just says, well, we can adjust what we need, and that really should be a minor question. So the fifth objection that he mentions is language. And learning the language is going to be difficult. But he says, okay, well, we can get interpreters. And again, we can go back to the commercial enterprises. They are able to carry out their work. So in the end, he says, really, we just need godly men. I like his qualifications for being a missionary. They must be men of great piety, prudence, courage, and forbearance, of undoubted orthodoxy in their sentiments, and they must enter with all their hearts into the spirit of their mission. They must be willing to leave all the comforts of life behind and to encounter all the hardships of a torrid or a frigid climate, an uncomfortable manner of living, and every other inconvenience that can attend this undertaking. And as we know, that's exactly what William Carey did. So he's not just talking idealism here. He's talking reality. Now, he didn't know what he was getting into, obviously, but he faced all of those things, very uncomfortable situations, really appalling situations, and even a climate and an environment and demands that took his wife over the brink mentally. So he answers those objections. And finally, he talks about the duty of this. He just says, essentially, let's do it. Let's get on with this. So the booklet. But there's a second impetus for the modern missionary movement, and that is the sermon. And the sermon that he preached to his fellow pastors was from Isaiah 54, verses 2 to 3. And I'll show that text in just a minute. But from that text, he came up with this famous quotation, probably no more famous quotation in all of missions history. As I've studied this again, I keep running across an explanation of the sermon and a title for it. It's called The Deathless Sermon. And I wondered why it was called that, and I've tried to research that, and no one seems to know, other than the fact that it just lives on. It has had an impact and continues to have an impact upon us today. So what is the quotation that Carey came up with to summarize his sermon? Well, I think you know it. Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. Don't you wish you could go hear that sermon? I mean, we don't have the actual text of the sermon. We have a pretty good idea of some of the things that he said. And I would like to take time to look at that text and to see if he's applied it correctly. But we won't have time for that. But I invite you to do that. It's an interesting study. I think it does have application for us. There is a quotation in the New Testament that seems to give warrant for making an application for current missions and really current missionary or Christian endeavor. So that's the impetus for the modern missionary movement. Here's the text. I'll just read this. You can follow along here. Enlarge the place of your tent, and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your offspring will possess the nations and will people the desolate cities. Now there's another reference here to the barren one, for instance. And so you want to study a little more than these two verses. Just study the context to see if his application is accurate, but I think he has warrant for his application. So how does this treatise have value? Two ways: historical value and theological value. Here's a quotation from the foreword of this one. It's not by Carey. There's a foreword before Carey's foreword. This was written by a guy named Keith Idle, and also there's a section by Page Patterson himself. And this is what they say: a treatise which spawned the modern missionary advance and served as an apology for the actions of a shoemaker is worthy of study by historians. So, of course, it has historical value. But it's also worthy of study by missiologists and historians of dogma. In other words, this has theological value. We need to be reminded that the Great Commission applies to us and all of the objections have been answered. But in the case of an inquiry, the principles enunciated have an enduring quality. The searing issues which wrung this plea from Carey are no less trenchant in our own era. And that's by Page Patterson in that foreword. Okay, so we discussed this a little bit earlier, and that is the theological environment in which Carey lived. Here's a response from an older pastor. I didn't have time to trace this one down, but I'm pretty certain this was done by a guy named John Ryland. And he had a son named John Ryland Jr. But I think this was the senior. And he said, "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine." This same man also called Carey an enthusiast, which was a pejorative term that he was using. It was not a positive statement. It's like, you're beside yourself. We cannot do this. We're not commanded to do this. God will do this in his own time and in his own way. But go back to the title of the inquiry. What was it? The obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. And the means are primarily people. In other words, us. So that was the environment that Carey was facing. These were particular Baptists. These were Calvinistic Baptist men, and some of them we would call hyper-Calvinists. But thankfully, they were not all that way. Now, I've talked about the modern missionary movement. It's pretty well understood that William Carey is the father of modern missions. You see this plaque. This is a plaque in Calcutta at the Baptist church there in downtown Calcutta, and it calls William Carey the father of modern missions. You see that right here? Okay. So pretty much everyone agrees with that statement. So we're going to look at his upbringing, and then we'll get to his work in India. But William Carey's upbringing was important for us to understand his thinking and his interest and even his health. So we're going to go to a rural setting in England, not all that far from London. And really, a lot of Carey's life took place in a small area. So he was born in a place called Paulers Perry. And we're going to see that still is a very rural setting. These pictures were taken not too long ago, a few years ago. And so you're looking essentially from the Anglican church, and I'll show you that church in a minute. But you're looking from the church out toward where Carey lived, about a mile away, just across the fields. So in that part of England, people do know about William Carey, at least some of them. And as you go down the road now is called Carey Road. Well, I knew that Carey lived somewhere along the road, but my brother-in-law and I were trying to find Carey's house, and we went up and down the road, couldn't find it. So we saw this lady sitting out there on her bench, and we thought, we'll stop and ask this lady. So understand, this road is, a mile or two long. So we stopped and talked to this lady. Well, can you see that right there? As God would have it, this is the very place where Carey was born. So we talked to this couple. Her husband came out, and we had a delightful chat with them. They have people come by frequently, as you might guess. But you can see there on the stone, this is where William Carey was born in 1761. So a little town, born in 1761, those dates are important. You might recall from church history that this was toward the end of the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley were men that were alive at this time. I forget exactly when Edwards died. I think Wesley died in like 1790s. David Brainerd died about that time. So a lot's going on in England and in America. So they're on the tail end of the Great Awakening. And back in those days, thatched roof was common. You still see those in England. A lot of work, a lot of expense, but back in those days, that was probably the cheaper route to go. So in the Anglican Church, which almost every village in England has an Anglican church, and we found the lady who is the caretaker. Now there's a key for you. You probably wouldn't want to put that one in your pocket, but she had the key to the church, and she let us in the church there in Paulus Perry, where Carey grew up. It's important to understand a little bit about his family. His father was the village clerk. He had been a weaver, but he apparently had a gift for teaching. So in those days, there sometimes would be a little school in the parish or in the church, in the village, and sometimes the schoolmaster would also be the village clerk. So what would the clerk do? Well, this is the church. You see my brother-in-law standing there in the pulpit. And the clerk's responsibility were to, he was to do the notations for weddings, marriages, those kinds of transactions. But he also was to introduce the sermon. And apparently he also would say amen to the end of the church prayers. So he had a responsibility in the church. So he might have been up in that pulpit. That would have been Edmund Carey, William Carey's father. So if you can picture little William down there in the church services, and the pastor up there in the pulpit, or his dad up there maybe saying amen to the prayers or introducing the sermon. So just to give you a feel for the size of things, Carey was born here in Paulus Perry and lived over toward Prairie End, which just a mile or so apart. But we're going to be talking about these areas here, these towns. You see Moulton. Carey pastored a church in Moulton. There was a church in Earls Barton. There was a bigger church up in Kettering. And we're going to talk about Andrew Fuller, very important person. And then Olney. If you don't know about Olney, you need to know about this little village because a lot of good things happened in Olney. Carey also had some work in Piddington, and he joined the church in Hackleton. So you can see we're talking 22 miles, maybe 30 some kilometers between Kettering and Olney, and then down here to Paulus Perry. So we're not talking about a huge area. But there was an association of Baptist pastors that got together that were in this basic area here around Northamptonshire. So I mentioned his dad. His dad's name is Edmund Carey. He's buried just outside that Anglican church door. So summarizing background on William Carey. He was the son of a weaver, but his dad became the schoolmaster and the parish clerk eventually, kind of a better job and utilizing his gifts. But keep in mind that he was a schoolmaster. Evidently, the family had a gift for teaching. William Carey himself opened a school, and of course, he was used as a teacher. He seems to have had great gifts along that line. But there's something else that we need to know, and that is, how did Carey know about the big wide world? He grew up in this small area, a rural area pretty much, of kind of a backwater in England, how did he know about the world? How did he get a burden for missions and the rest of the world and its needs? Well, one of the influences upon his life was an uncle. He had been a gardener, but he had joined the army and he went to Canada. And they thought he had gone to Canada and either died or never planned to come back. But he came back to England. And so Carey spent time with him, and this uncle would tell him stories about Canada, about the French, and about the British, and about what was happening over there. And he needed to learn some kind of trade, so Carey learned shoemaking. At the age of 19, he was married to Dorothy. She was from a godly dissenting family in Hackleton. People make much of the fact that she was illiterate, but apparently, from all I can read, that was fairly typical for the women of that day. Doesn't mean she was unintelligent. In fact, I would guess from the gifts of the children that she was very intelligent, but she was not able to read. Eventually, Carey did teach her how to read. Well, Carey was not a believer as he attended the church there in Polisbury, the Anglican church. But the Lord placed him as an apprentice, and he was staying in the house of a man named Clark Nichols. Nichols was not a believer either, at least at this time, but the man who worked alongside of Carey, a young man by the name of John Warr, was a believer. And he was diligent in witnessing to Carey, and eventually Carey came to faith. So, being an Anglican, what would he have thought about baptism? Well, he would have been baptized already, right? Baptized as an infant. But the people that he was getting to know were dissenters. That means they were not satisfied with the teaching and the practice of the Church of England, and many of them were Baptist. And so he got to know the Baptists, and as he studied the Word, he became convinced that their teaching on baptism was right. It should be believers' baptism. So he was baptized in the River Nen by John Ryland. Remember that name? The father had been the one who resisted Carey's challenges, but the son became a good friend of Carey. So I'm going to mention this now. We'll touch on it again, but there were about 4 men that were very important in the life of William Carey. They were his supporters, they were his encouragers, and they were the ones who, I say supporters, I mean emotionally as well as financially. They were a big encouragement to him until they died. And then there was a problem, and we won't have a lot of time to talk about the Serampore Schism, but those men understood Carey, they appreciated him. The younger group that came in were zealous for the Lord as well, but they didn't fully understand the early stages of Carey's thinking and practice. But these men that you need to remember are John Ryland, John Sutcliffe, and Andrew Fuller. So if you would, try to remember those names, very important. Fuller was what was called the secretary of the mission agency, and he and Carey corresponded frequently. So he was baptized, and notice what one of his friends, or John Ryland, says about him. On October 5th, 1783, I baptized in the Nen, just beyond Doddridge's meeting house, a poor journeyman shoemaker, little thinking that before 9 years elapsed, he would prove the first instrument of forming a society for sending missionaries from England to the heathen world, and much less that later he would become professor of languages in an Oriental college and the translator of the scriptures into 11 different tongues. Actually, it was a good bit more than that. But just a word of encouragement to all of you. who are listening, think about his beginnings. He never thought much of himself. But the fact is, God did use William Carey in a great way. But what did he have going for him? Well, on a human level, not much. But on the divine level, he was an instrument that God used in a mighty way. So encourage yourselves personally that God can use you, even though it may not seem that you have a lot to offer. And on the ministerial level, or on the ministry level, you can encourage your people that God can use them in a great way if they will yield to him, as William Carey did. So never underestimate how God will use a humble convert. Okay, a little bit more about the environment and the Baptist of those days. As I mentioned, he became associated with dissenters, and these were Baptist dissenters. He became very studious in the word, and so even before he was ordained, he became a preacher, a lay preacher, but he had to work as a cobbler to meet the needs of his family. So I'll show you another picture in a minute, but just to reiterate some of the things we've covered so far. He joined the Hackleton Church. That was a Baptist church. That was a small church back in those days. Most of these Baptist churches of that era had very little money. They couldn't even pay Carey enough to buy clothes to come. He wore out clothing. They couldn't even pay him enough to buy clothing to come and preach to them. But he did that as a lay preacher for 3.5 years. He would walk to these churches. Some cases, it was like a 6-mile walk one way. He was baptized 1783. Then he pastored in Moulton, and he was ordained while there. But I have here, he had a 1-year wait. You might wonder, why did he have to wait to be ordained? You would think they would be excited about a man who's studying the word, who's evidently has God's call upon him. Well, evidently, Carey was not a particularly impressive preacher. One of the men said this about his preaching early on. He said, "You need to use more likes." Do you know what he's talking about when he says that? Well, he was saying that Carey's preaching was pretty much devoid of illustrations. He didn't say like Jesus, this is like, a fig tree, or this is like a sheep, or he didn't have those windows in his sermon that let in light. So apparently early on his preaching was a little dry, but over time God's hand was greatly upon him and the churches there grew. And so he was ordained after a year of what they called probation, just to see if he really did have God's call upon him. So going back to the church that he joined, this is what it says. Even today you can read this on the Hackleton Baptist Church. This place of worship was erected to the glory of God in memory of Dr. Carey, the father of modern missions to the heathen, and one of the founders and the first missionary of the Baptist Missionary Society. He toiled as a shoemaker. He actually called himself a cobbler. He didn't consider himself even a good shoemaker. That was not his gift. In fact, a businessman came to see what Carey was doing one day, and he noticed that he was studious, but he wasn't the greatest cobbler. And so he said, you really don't need to spend any more time making shoes. I'm going to try to help pay for you to study and to do your ministry. So Carey was not a great cobbler. He might not have even considered himself a shoemaker. But that's what this says anyway. And so he was a preacher, preached his first sermon in the village of Hackleton. And here's the church, at least a few years ago, was still in use. And there's a sign there on the front telling the service times. I didn't get into that church, did not meet the pastor. Most of these churches now are part of the British Baptist Union. I'm not sure if this one is, and I'm not sure if it still exists or if it's still meeting there. So how did he get such a burden for missions? Well, it began from a personal study of the Word. By the way, you might want to apply these things. If you want to see missionaries raised up from your churches and your Bible colleges, then these are the things that typically God uses. Of course, a study of the Word. Not going to happen if the person is not diligent in the Word. But also, he was reading books about Captain Cook's voyages, especially to the Pacific and that part of the world. So Carey says this: reading Cook's voyages was the first thing that engaged my mind to think of missions. So if a man has a heart for the Word and he's reading about other parts of the world, he's going to think along these lines. And probably you thought this: I wonder if there's a church in that village. I wonder how many churches there are in that country. I wonder how many people are believers in that nation. And so that's one of the things that stirred William Carey. He was reading Cook's voyages. But another, and I mentioned this earlier because I knew I was coming to it, there was a man that he read about named John Eliot. I found it interesting that he spelled Eliot E-double-L-I-O-T in his inquiry. But the real spelling is E-L-I-O-T. But anyway, John Eliot is from England, and he had gone to Cambridge. This was back in the 1600s. He went to one of the colleges there called Jesus College. But just about a decade after the Pilgrims landed in America, John Eliot came over to America, and he is called the Apostle to the Indians. I invite you to learn more about this man, a remarkable man. He translated, as I mentioned, the Bible into the Algonquin Indian language. The first Bible published in America wasn't an English Bible. The first Bible published in America was an Algonquin Bible. And he translated the entire Bible into the Indian language. That's quite a feat. But in addition to that, he went around evangelizing the area around Boston, Massachusetts, and established several churches. And not only that, he trained Indian men to pastor those churches. And not only that, he started a church for the colonists in a place called Roxbury, which is just a suburb of Boston, not far from Harvard and Cambridge. And so Eliot was pastoring a fairly large church of colonists. He was learning the Indian language. He was translating the Bible and other books into their language. He was evangelizing them. It's amazing what the man did. And so reading about him challenged William Carey. And here's a picture of, not a photo, but a painting of John Eliot. But another thing that affected Carey was reading Edwards' account of the life of Brainerd. And finally, Carey had a great desire to learn about the needs around the world. So he actually made maps. And I'll show you a reproduction of the map. But thinking about Brainerd just for a moment, don't forget that William Carey was influenced by a man who died at the age of 29, a man that he had never met, a man who was not married, and yet his influence lives on. This is what we read about David Brainerd. let us often look at Brainerd in the woods of America, pouring out his very soul before God for the people. Prayer, secret, fervent, expectant, lies at the root of all personal godliness. A competent knowledge of the languages current where a missionary lives, a mild and winning temper, and a heart given up to God. These are the attainments which, more than all other gifts, will fit us to become God's instruments in the great work of human redemption. And that's Carey, and that's quoted in Timothy George's biography. Let me just take a second to mention some of the biographies. This is a good one. It's by Timothy George. There's actually a movie made about Carey. It's sort of based on this one. Timothy George is a historian. And so his biography focuses a lot on history, as you might expect. So that's one. And then there's another one by a lady named Mary Drury. It's called William Carey, believe it or not. Very simple title. Then there's one about his wife called Dorothy Carey. We're not going to talk a lot about her, but she is 50% of the ministry. And so you wonder, how can a man have been so effective when his wife was struggling so? But probably the one that I would recommend the most is this one by Samuel Pierce Carey, I believe his great-grandson. And so this is maybe the one I would recommend the most. All right, Joel, should we take a 5-minute break, or do we want to keep going? Doesn't matter to me.
If this is a good interchange for taking a break, that works.
Okay. What's up, 5 minutes, 10? What's the plan?
Well, maybe we do 5.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just insert here, and this is from the, no, I'll wait. If we have time, if we have a couple of minutes at the end, then we can do a little bit of discussion. So that sounds good. Let's proceed with, let's take a break, and I've got 2 minutes to the hour. So 3 minutes after the hour, we'll pick up again. Just 5 minutes from now. So
right.
Never mind, the clock just changed. I've got 1 minute to the hour, so I'll see you at 4 minutes after the hour. There you go. I gave you an extra 60 seconds.
All right.
Okay, we'll talk again.
Okay.
Okay, I believe we are ready to continue on. So, Dr. Patterson, looking forward to what else you'll share with us here.
Okay. Well, we've had a good start, and I think I'm going to allow the pictures now to speak more than maybe up to this point. So we're going to get right back into the PowerPoint and see if we can get to the end. I'm not sure if we'll have a lot of time for questions, but we'll jump right back into Carey's training. He is pastor in Moulton, and so the church in Moulton is today called Carey Baptist Church. It is I won't call it a thriving church. It may be a little different now. We were there a few years ago. But in the church at that time, they had a wonderful mural along one side of the church that gave the life of Carey. I'm not going to go through that. I'll reference 2 or 3 pictures from it. But here's the pastor and a lady that sort of oversees the historical parts there at Moulton Baptist Church. Again, this church is part of the Baptist Union, I believe, which is a mixed bag. But this man seemed to be a man of God, and the church service was pretty heavy on prayer, and I would say Bible reading, that sort of thing. So it was honoring to the Lord when we were there. So here's a little closer up of that mural, and it really kind of gives the whole history. If you have time to look through it sometime, I could send you other pictures of it. But here's something that was a big deal for William Carey, and that is the sati, the widow burning. And he was very much opposed to that. The practice was, in some cases, for the widow to be burned when her husband died, to be burned as sort of an offering to the gods. And so obviously a very heathen and barbarous practice. So he opposed that strongly, and eventually it was outlawed in India. So those who don't appreciate Carey as a missionary appreciate him as one who had an impact on humanitarian issues. You can still see the little shop. That was his cobbler shop in Moulton. You can't see it. It's not the greatest picture, but I'm holding a shoe. And inside the shoe is a sort of a wooden mold that he would put in there and use that to work on the shoes. The bench there is one that he used. The bench is on the floor. And they have his pulpit there in the corner of that room. You can see the room's very small in the right-hand picture there. There's a little closer look at the form that he would put into the shoe, and then his bench. And you can see that little room there with the yellow door is where he would do his cobbling. And there is extant a sign that says, if you can read it, second-hand shoes bought and sold here. So that comes from Carey's day. Well, he was burdened for missions, but nobody else was. Although there were some coming in that direction. And so as he talked to his friends, and you might remember these names, I'll keep mentioning them because they had a great impact on England at the time. Even back home, these men were influential. For instance, Ryland or Sutcliffe was a graduate of a Bible school over in Bristol. And I was talking with Clay Gibbons, who I believe is with us today. I believe that Bible school still functions. So Andrew Fuller, John Ryland, and John Sutcliffe were important men. There were others that were part of the Baptist group, and so they said, okay, you're so burdened for missions, why don't you just preach to us and present your ideas? And so he did. He spent, I don't know how many weeks writing up this inquiry, and here you can see again the title for it. And then he preached his deathless sermon on Isaiah 54, and that's when he made the statement, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And in that church in Moulton, it's a little bit hard to see, but there is a stained glass window that says that phrase. So the world knows about this phrase, but here's a question for you, a theological question. Is the order correct? Expect and then attempt, or is it attempt and then expect? Well, I like his order. It makes sense to me. And here's why. I think the order is correct because when I think about it, you might argue against this, but think about this. Without faith, we cannot truly serve God, right? So everything we do has to begin with faith. In other words, faith must feed our service. So I'm good with his order. First faith and then Christian enterprise, Christian ministry. Expect, believe great things from God, and then attempt great things for God. Of course, the order could be reversed, and there's truth to that as well. Well, I mentioned that he had a burden for the whole world, and the proof for that is that he made these maps, or made this map. This is not the original, but his great-grandson and some others got together based on what they heard from and read from Andrew Fuller and others who saw Carey in his workshop. And in his workshop, he would have this map. And if you'll notice, there's some writing on it. It's hard to see. I'm not going to try to zoom in too closely, but I did zoom in a bit. it gets blurry, but you can see that what he's done is for each part of the world, he has gathered as much information as he can, and whenever he gets information, he writes it down on his map. And so that's where he got the information for the middle part of his inquiry, the part with the charts and tables and information. Well, I mentioned John Sutcliffe, and Sutcliffe was in Olney. And Olney is quite the place because of some of the people who live there. Of course, in Olney you had John Sutcliffe. He's buried. You can see in the top left, kind of hard to see, but he's buried there. This is the Sutcliffe Baptist Church now, right on Main Street, which is not a big town at all. It's just really a village still. There's Sutcliffe's grave outside the church, and that is the pastor. So this church still functions, and from what I could tell, I was not in a service, but it's not a large church. Apparently, back in John Sutcliffe's day, it could accommodate hundreds of people. I saw the number 700, which was unusual, but that shows you that Sutcliffe himself was an important figure among the Baptists. But just a few hundred yards away was another famous man, John Newton. And this is the picture of the Church of England there in Olney. So Newton and Sutcliffe, and also William Cowper. You may know that name from your hymn books. He wrote probably his most famous song or hymn is, "There is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins." So Sutcliffe and Newton had a great respect for one another. Carey respected Newton. They were contemporary, and at least for part of the time. And William Cowper lived right on Main Street, and he and Newton would often get together in Cowper's garden. And you see on the right there, my brother-in-law and I are at that little shed where Newton and Cowper would often meet and pray and discuss. Actually, Newton would often counsel Cowper. Cowper had a real tendency to depression and had 5 serious bouts with that. But this is Cowper's house right on the little main street there in Olney. Cowper was eccentric. There's no other way to put it. Going back to Newton's church, this is the pulpit. So today, if you were to go to the Anglican church in town, back in the corner now, they don't make much of it. You can see they even have children's toys and things around. But this is Newton's pulpit. And so he and Cowper would often get together. Here's just a little bit more about Cowper. This is inside the little shed there. My brother-in-law is indicating maybe they would smoke a pipe. Also, some other people you might have heard of are Thomas Scott. He served there in Olney. He wrote a Bible commentary. Here's a picture of Newton. There's a nice museum in Olney that talks about William Cowper, and it shows you the house that he lived in. And so you can see he was, again, just a little bit eccentric even in the way he would dress. This is a painting of him going outside to protect his orange tree at night from the frost. He would go out and try to stoke the fire, keep it warm. So as we think about the beginning of missions, foreign missions, modern missions, we need now to get to the beginning of a mission agency. The men of that day felt that agencies could be very useful. And so Carey kept pushing for the beginning of some kind of dedication to doing something, which in his mind meant having a missionary society. 1791, he called for action. The men talked about it, did nothing. He finally decided to, at their urging, to publish the inquiry. 1792. But still, they were reluctant to do anything. So finally, Carey said, "Is there nothing to be done?" He was at his wit's end. He could not believe they would keep talking about it but not do anything. So they finally decided to take pledges, and a few pounds were pledged. And that was the beginning of what originally was called, notice the name, the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Amongst the Heathen. That doesn't sound like GFA. That's a long name. I don't know how you would make an acronym out of that. PBSPGAH, however that was. You try to figure that one out. But eventually they shortened it to BMS. And I think you can maybe guess that that is the Baptist Missionary Society. So that's what it's called even today, I believe. So there is downtown Olney. There's the church. No, I'm sorry. We're moving over to Kettering, and I want to talk a little bit about Andrew Fuller because he was really a key. Once he was persuaded, things began to move, and he was a good friend of Carey's and really shared his burden. He just wasn't sure that they should start a mission agency, but they did. And today, Fuller Baptist Church in Kettering still exists, still doing relatively well. I assume I did not go to a service there, but you can see a picture here of Andrew Fuller, and he was a pretty stocky, solid sort of guy in a lot of ways. He was also, by the way, a British theologian. He wrote a book on systematic theology. He was a very capable man, and that book still exists. I haven't read his theology, but from what I read about him, it would be very helpful. Well, I mentioned that Carey pushed to have something done, and it happened here in the Gospel Inn. This family, the Wallace family, would host men when they would come into Kettering. And so they were meeting in a back parlor, and this is where they decided to begin the Baptist Missionary Society, or as it says, the Particular Baptist. And why would it be called Particular Baptist? Well, that's another story, but it focuses on their Calvinistic persuasion. They believe that the atonement was particularly for the elect and them only. So that's the reason for that name. A little bit more about the Baptist Missionary Society. It did a great work. Other men, such as William Knibb, went to Jamaica. In 1842, they had their Jubilee. So in the church in Kettering, there's a nice historical room that gives you a lot of information about the Baptist Missionary Society. The centenary in 1892, 100 years after the beginning. So the Baptist Missionary Society begins. In order to have a society, what do you need? You need missionaries. Okay. Well, we've never had a missionary. Where do we get one? Where do we send him? Well, that was the issue for the Baptist Missionary Society. But as it turns out, God had already begun to raise up we'll back off here one second. God had begun to raise up a missionary in India. In fact, a man had already been there and had already done that. And we'll get to who that was in just a minute. But let's go back to William Carey himself. He's the one pushing for a society. Question is, will he himself go? And to him, there's no question. Sure, I will go. I feel obligated to go. Next question. Is he married? Answer is yes. We talked about him getting married at the age of 19 to a girl 5 years older than him. And with the name Dorothy. Plackett was her last name. So the next question would be, does Dorothy want to go? That's a huge question. I work at a mission agency, and we always understand and operate on the principle that the wife is 50% of the team. What is the wife's thinking about this? Is she reluctant? Is she eager? Does she understand at all what she's committing to? So, what about Dorothy? Well, I wish we could discuss this, but we won't take the time. I think you understand that Dorothy was reluctant. Okay, another question to explain her reluctance in part. Do they have any children? Does anyone know? Maybe you could send a note to Joel and he could read it out. Does anyone know if they had any children at this time? Anybody remember? Have you read anything about this? Send a note to Joel and say.
First comment, I honestly don't know.
Okay.
Clay Gibbons said 3.
Okay. Any others?
Not yet.
All right. Well, that's a good thing I asked the question, because probably the others don't know either. And frankly, I would not have remembered if I hadn't studied this again. But Clay, you're very close. They had 3 under the age of 10, but they had just had a baby named Jabez, who was, I believe, 3 weeks old. So that puts a different perspective on this. Dorothy is not eager to go. In fact, the question is, will she go at all? So here's where we are. Carey himself said, I have never wavered about the duty itself, but I feel much leaving my family and people. Wait a minute, leaving my family? What does he mean here? Well, he and Dorothy had an uneasy agreement. I would say that would be an uneasy one. That William would go to India with 8-year-old Felix and live there 4 years, okay? After which he would return for his family. Dorothy would live in Hackleton with her younger sister, Catherine. What do you think of that? Well, Carey had a sense that this was his duty. He did not want to leave his family, did not want to leave his wife. He had hoped that she would agree to go, but she did not want to go. So as it's put here, they had an uneasy agreement that he would go for 4 years without his family except for Felix. So that's a different perspective on missions, right? We don't think that way these days, but remember, this was the beginning of modern missions. What do? His wife was not willing. He felt an absolute duty, and so something had to be worked out. So that was their plan. Well, I mentioned that you need some missionaries to go. Carey really needed someone to go with him. He didn't want to go by himself. He had never been to India. He didn't know the language. So what's going to happen? Well, God sent a man by the name of John Thomas. Thomas was a doctor. He had spent some time in India already. He knew the language to a degree. He had a heart for the people. And it was determined that John Thomas would be their missionary and Carey would join him. So they were planning to leave. In fact, they had gotten on a boat and they were out getting ready to get on the boat that would eventually take them to India. But there was a delay. And Carey and Thomas said, especially Thomas actually, Carey had pretty much given up on Dorothy's going, but Thomas said, let's go talk to her again. So they did. And she still said no. And Thomas said, well, let's try again. So he persisted and actually talked Dorothy. I mean, just within a few hours, things changed. And Dorothy said, okay, I'll go. but I want my sister, Catherine, to go as well. So they had 3-week-old Jabez and 3 other children at this time, and they make plans finally for Dorothy to go with them. So here's a painting of John Thomas. He was a doctor. He lived in Calcutta. He knew the language. He had a heart for the Lord, but he had a terrible problem with debt. And that was an ongoing issue, and really he never learned how to handle money. But Carey respected him. Carey had a way of seeing the good in pretty much everyone. So they decided to send them, and they take off, and they do go to Calcutta. So what does Carey have to offer? He's going as a missionary, going to this heathen land. What does he have going for him? What's his resume? Okay, educationally, minimal. What kind of degrees does he have? None. How much savings does he have? Well, Thomas ended up spending almost all the money that came to them. He lived pretty, what we would say, I don't know if this is a Southern expression, but he lived high on the hog. In other words, he lived a pretty sumptuous life in Calcutta. So Carey and his family had virtually nothing. He never had money to begin with, so savings were depleted. Political influence, none. No one knew him. Sorry about that. What about his wife's attitude? Reluctant? His references, a band of country preachers half a world away. Well, what were his resources? Think about this. He's going as a missionary to a foreign land that he's never been to, no survey trips. Resources, adequate? Well, he had this weapon, the weapon of love for people. He had this desire to bring the light of God into the darkness. He had a strategy to proclaim by life, lips, and letters the unsearchable riches of Christ. He had a determination to obey God's call no matter the cost. And he himself had an ability, and he said his only ability was to plod, to follow through on whatever he began. Apparently that was true for him even as a very young man, because his sister talks about that. So he's in Calcutta now. They arrive. I've highlighted a few places. This is a map of Calcutta. Notice on the left, the River Hooghly. That's important. Then I've also highlighted Fort William. Eventually, after Carey learned the languages, he was considered an Oriental scholar, maybe the best in the world among British-speaking people. So he taught at Fort William, and that was a means of supporting himself. Let me just throw this in here. Carey was also influenced by the Moravians. They started back in the 1720s, their missionary work. So he's after them. In some ways, you almost could argue they were the beginning of modern missions. But at any rate, they had a philosophy, and that was to be tent makers, to provide for their own support. And that was Carey's plan. Eventually, he wanted to support himself. And it worked out that happened. He worked at Fort William as a teacher, and that supported him and the work. And then there's Lal Bazaar, you can see up here. That's very close to where he spent most of his time. There was a church there and a couple of churches in that area, so we'll get to that. Okay, just a map of India, just to give you some perspective if you haven't looked at India lately. Over on the far west is Mumbai. They've changed the names from the British spellings. They used to call it Bombay. There's a place called Surat, a guy named Dr. George Johnson. George, I'm sorry. Some of you may know, guys, PhD from BJ. He lives up there and ministers there in that area. Madras, just a little bit of missions history that it seems that Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, went to there. It's Chennai now. And then over on the east side is Calcutta, and that's where we're going to focus. Now, just a little bit north, about 16 miles north of Calcutta, is Serampore, where Carey lived and had his ministry for the most part. So we're going to zero in now on this area. I might just point out that India actually encircles Bangladesh. And this area in here is seeing some amazing results these days among the Christians. So God's doing a really good work over in this area in particular. So I may reference this later. All right, going back to Calcutta, though, this is where they began, but the East India Company did not want missionaries. So they had some difficulty staying anywhere for very long. But at first, Carey said, okay, I've got to support myself. So he decided to go into this area, a very marshy area. Probably was not good for his family health-wise, but he did spend some time down in the Sundarbans area. And then he heard about a way to provide for himself up here in Mundabadi. So he went up here and had an indigo plantation. So he was running that for a while. That sort of fizzled, and so he needed somewhere to go. And there was the governor of this area of Serampore who invited him and his friends to come and have ministry there. And so that's what he did. That's a very quick rundown of how he got to Serampore. But the governor of Serampore, Mr. Bie, a Danish man, this was under Danish control, and so the British did not have say-so there, and so they could go and have ministry. So what did William Carey look like? Well, we don't have photos, but we have some paintings. So this is Carey, and there was a trio of laborers in Serampore. One of these men was Joshua Marshman. He and his wife, before they went to India, had a school, a charity school. And so their gifts were working with children and educating them. So they started a school and were able to charge for that, and that brought in a good bit of income. So the Serampore ministry was self-sufficient and actually used some of their funds for establishing ministries in other parts of India. The other part of the trio was William Ward, and he was the printer. Carey eventually, as you know, did a lot of translation, and they did a lot of printing. So if you go to Serampore today, this is the train station. You might know Ashish Majmundar. He is Indian. He's an American citizen now, but was able to travel to Serampore with him, and you can see the spelling there. I think that's Bengali and Hindi, the other two languages. This is what Serampore looks like today. It hasn't changed really a whole lot. As you go down the streets, you see a lot of the Hinduism. It just makes you sick, frankly. You see three of the main gods, and nothing attractive about it as far as we would say. In fact, it's repulsive. But this is pretty much what William Carey would have seen. I don't think the idolatry part has changed a whole lot. This is just going to the college there. As we got off the train station, got in a rickshaw, you see a man worshiping there in Serampore. This is the street. Again, you see this has not changed a whole lot. Might have been pulled by a horse or a donkey back in those days, or a man. Well, this is the location that the governor gave them for starting their ministry, and it continues today as Serampore College. It's one of the more elite colleges in India. However, and it's still Christian, but it's not a strong Christianity. But we had a good time there. We met with the president of Serampore College, and just a little orientation before we talk about specifics. Okay, here's the River Hooghly. Remember that? It runs down to Calcutta. That's very important because the way Carey would go to Calcutta was by boat. So the main building is, I'll get there. There's the main building. We'll show you a picture of that. But this is where the Carey Museum is, and so we're going to spend a little time there just at the end here in a few minutes. And then the Carey House, and that's important because that's where Carey lived and that's where he died. So we're in Calcutta, a massive city of probably 15, 20 million people. Anywhere you go in India, you got people. It's probably the most densely populated place I've ever seen by far. But I wanted to just note that this is the current police station there, but notice Lal Bazaar. That's the area where Carey had his church and where they had a Bible school. So this is one of the streets that Carey would have, of course now it's paved, but he would have crossed this area many times. Now this hasn't changed much, so you can go back in time about 200 years, and this is sort of a Victorian look. This church still exists, still functions as Carey Baptist Church, and there's a parsonage. And when we were there, we stayed in the second floor here. The pastor has a parsonage, and in the top floor is still some bedrooms. It's quite a large building. So on the outside, you see it's Carey Baptist Church, built, 200 years ago. So quite the facility here. And on the outside, you have Carey's quotation. And what's interesting, and this will introduce us to the lecture on Thursday, in that church, you have a plaque to a guy named Luther Rice, and you're also going to have one related to Adoniram Judson. And it says, Rice embraced Baptist views and was baptized in this chapel, not by Carey, but by the Reverend William Ward of Serampore in 1812. So there's a connection between the American roots and the British roots. Luther Rice is buried here in South Carolina, not very far from here, but he's an important man because he was a good friend of Judson. They went over together, and interestingly enough, they were both convinced of the Baptist position as they went to India. They began to study. They came in contact with some English Baptists. And when they got to Calcutta, they met William Carey, they met William Ward, and they met Joshua Marshman. And they said, we want you to baptize us. So this is inside the Carey Baptist Church. I'm standing right above the baptismal pool. It's covered up. But that's where Judson was baptized. That's where Luther Rice was baptized. There's also a plaque to Adoniram Judson. So we'll talk more about them on Thursday. So here's the house. Here's the president of Serampore College. He was very gracious to let us into his home. This is where he lives. This was a few years ago. I assume he's still the president, but he let us into his home, and this is the room. Well, this is where Carey lived. And in one of these side rooms, one of these bedrooms, is where he died. So this is what amazes me. You can probably guess what that is. It's this, they call it a sofa, basically a bed upon which William Carey died. But it's not in Serampore. It is now in England, in Oxford, in the Angus Library connected with Regent's Park College. Regent's Park, if you ever get a chance to go to Oxford, which I know it's a long ways for many of you probably won't go anytime soon. But this is the Baptist, basically the Baptist library. It gives a lot of Baptist history. And on the wall, this is what it says. On this couch, William Carey died at sunrise, June 9, 1834. So going back to Serampore, this is what the college looks like today. That's the main place. They have their theological college there. It's also a liberal arts school. But just off to the west of that, to the left here, if you look down, you can probably see this is the river Hooghly. And so if you went this way, just off to the right here, a few hundred yards, you'd be up to the college. But this is what I want us to look at right here. Amazing story. Krishna Paul, the first convert that they knew about in India. This is where he was baptized. And of course, beside it today is right here is a Hindu shrine, which is kind of a sad thing. But this says, in remembrance of Krishna Paul, the first Christian of Bengal who was baptized by Dr. William Carey on Sunday, December 28, 1800. So Carey got there in 1793. So how long did he have to wait to see a convert? 7 years. But someone else had been there before Carey. Who was that? I wish I could hear you say it, but I can't, so I'm going to assume you remember. His name is John Thomas. Right, you got it. Well, how long did Thomas have to wait to see a convert? Well, it was about 15 years from the first time he arrived in India. So the story is, I mean, it's not a story. The reality is Thomas, there's no other way to put it except this. Thomas lost it mentally at the baptism of John Thomas. He was so excited that he mentally had to be restrained. They put him in a straitjacket. He had temporary insanity because he was so thrilled to see the convert and the baptism of this guy, Krishna Paul. There's a painting of John Thomas. I had forgotten this, but Thomas actually died pretty soon after the baptism. It says here he never fully recovered from the overexcitement of Krishna Paul's conversion. He died of malaria in 1801. So what did Carey think of him? This guy, he used up the money that was supposed to go to Carey's family. He just did not have any sense. In fact, creditors had come after him when he was in England. When Carey was getting ready to go that first time, creditors came looking for John Thomas. Not a good way to start your missionary career. But anyway, Carey said this. He likened him to Simon Peter for his strength of impulse, extolled him as the first Englishman to so care for the souls of Bengalis as to learn to preach the gospel in their language, to translate for them books of the Bible, and to be their honorary physician. He loved the Bengali people. He was a physician. He served them basically without pay. So there were some very good things about John Thomas. And really, let's not forget, without him, Carey probably could not have gone to India to begin with. So how did he explain his success? In a word, Carey said, I can't do many things, but I can plod. So, how about you? Can you keep your hand to the plow when things are difficult? We don't have time to consider all the difficulties that Carey faced. Obviously, the biggest one was his wife. She became insane pretty soon after their arrival in India. Do you know what she would say about Carey? Do you remember reading anything about that? Anybody, real quickly? What was her complaint? Maybe shoot a note to Joel real quickly. Maybe you don't know. If you don't know, just say you don't know and we can move on here. Anybody know?
I don't know. I'm not seeing any messages yet.
Okay. Well, she complained that she said he had been unfaithful, and it was totally untrue. But she became very suspicious. She became really just out of her mind. And so in order to protect her, they had to keep her in a separate room. She attacked Carey, tried to kill him a few times. She just really lost it mentally for the last 12 years of her life. And it's understandable. She was reluctant to go in the first place. She was facing, obviously, what's the word? It escaped me. When you have, right after that, postpartum. She had postpartum depression probably. And just could not handle the climate and all the stress of the finances. And she just began to make wild accusations that no one believed is true. But Carey would not put her in a mental asylum. He felt, I guess, responsible. He felt no doubt somewhat guilty. And so they kept her in a separate room there in Serampore, even until her death. But she was dangerous. He had to be very careful because she attacked him with a knife, or tried to. So, summarizing Carey's ministry there in India, he founded Serampore College for training church planters and evangelists. You can see his pulpit was there in the museum. He taught in Calcutta as professor of Oriental languages. If you remember, the place was Fort William. He fought against evil social practices, sati, the widow burning, and infanticide. And he helped pastor the Serampore church. The man was busy, but, and I don't mention this anywhere else, I don't show any pictures, but Carey was quite the botanist. From an early age, he had loved being outside. He loved plants. He loved, plants in particular. The problem was, when he was a young fellow, he was outside, he got some kind of virus. It caused him to be very sensitive to sun for long exposure, and it also caused him to lose his hair. So Carey did wear a wig pretty early in his life. On his travel over to India, he decided to get rid of it. Probably a good thing. It would have been too hot. So when you see him, you usually see that he's bald with a little tuft around the sides. So very busy man. He loved botany, and he spent his mornings meditating, reading, a lot of times in his garden there in Serampore. No evidence of that nowadays. The other men, just very quickly, that he worked with, William Ward was the printer. But these men were gifted themselves. He was a writer and a scholar. He wrote, you can see, I won't read that long title. So William Ward was very needed as the printer for the work. And eventually they were just putting out literally tons of printed materials. They did, of course, a lot of Christian publications, but they believed that they should know the thinking of the people, and so they actually published some things that were indigenous and not necessarily Christian. Now, Joshua Marshman and his wife were very instrumental in helping Carey with his children. You think about it, his wife is insane, and Carey has to face that, and so he needed help with his children. There was some weakness there in the training of the children. But the Marshmans were very good, and they helped tremendously with raising those children. His wife, Hannah, was just a very godly woman that Carey admired greatly. Going back to the Angus Library, it has this is a relic. We just don't worship it, right? But this is hair from William Ward, William Carey, and Joshua Marshman. This is Carey's Bible. Now look at the fingers. That's a very fine print. So it's no wonder that his eyesight was failing pretty early. But apparently he could continue to read until he died. This is Lucy Plackett. This is Dorothy's sister, who did go with her. She was a help to her. She eventually married over in India. And this is the museum. And I just find this absolutely fascinating. And also, in a sense, there's a sad note to it as well. But you see along here, these are, supposedly, there are about 40 different languages that Carey worked with. I think once you learn one of those, there's some overlap. And so he was obviously a super, super gifted linguist. So this is the man that was the curator of the museum when I was there. And he showed us around. He actually had written some books about Carey, both in Hindi and also in English. I'll come back to him in just a minute, but I wanted to put somewhere in this presentation the three wives of William Carey. It's very easy to talk about him and forget that he was married and did have family. Dorothy Plackett, we've talked about. She was godly, not well read, did not share Carey's missionary burden, and she became insane for the last 12 years of her life. So what happened after that? Well, Carey knew this lady, Charlotte. She was the daughter of a Danish count. She was kind of the opposite of Dorothy in that she was well educated. She had a real burden for what Carey was doing. She was really a soulmate. And pretty early after Dorothy died, he married Charlotte. And apparently it was just a delightful marriage. I found it interesting that Carey baptized all three of his wives, including her. She was weak in health, and one of the reasons she had come to Serampore was to find a climate that supposedly would be helpful to her. So she was somewhat invalid, but they had a delightful marriage. Loved Carey, loved his work, and loved his children, which was very important. But she died before he did, so he married again, married a widow. She had two husbands pass away. She was much younger than Carey, and he appreciated her. She was his nurse in his later years. Well, getting back to the curator, here he is at William Carey's desk, a roll-top desk, really a nice piece of furniture. But I remember talking to him, and I found out that he was a Hindu. I couldn't believe it. I said, well, you love William Carey. You've written about him, and you admire him. You talk to people from all over the world about him. I don't understand. And this is what he told me, and I've never forgotten this. I never will forget it. This is what he said, literally. I am not dissatisfied with my religion. So, how he could be a Hindu, I have no idea after knowing Carey, seeing that work. But this man has died since that time, and I don't know, I've not heard that he became a Christian. So, it's kind of an aside there, but really just amazed me that he could admire Carey so much and yet not have his faith. Well, some of you Hebrew scholars, I thought you might enjoy this letter that Carey wrote to Andrew Fuller. Carey was quite a linguist. He learned Hebrew early. Fuller knew Hebrew. Carey learned Latin. He learned Dutch. I mean, the guy was just really amazing. Can you read what that says right across here? Anybody want to try? Somebody shoot Joel an email or a chat. What does it say? Go from right to left, obviously.
It looks like the last word is to Fuller.
Very good.
From Carey to Fuller. Check it out.
Exactly. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Fuller, I put it in here kind of backwards, but he says from Carey to Fuller. A few other things about the end of his life. He had fallen, hurt himself. These are his crutches. That's Johnson George, by the way. He has a ministry over on the west side of India. I mentioned that he would go down to Fort William to teach. And basically he would get in this boat and drift down. And he would sleep during the night. So when he got there, he was ready to go the next day. He had to be rowed back up the river, obviously. Well, a few quotations from William Carey that give his heart, and you know, this is what we're looking for. This is what we need. This is what we want to take away from this. How important is time? One moment gone is gone eternally. The opportunity to honor God or benefit fellow mortals irrecoverably past. And I like this one too. The worth of souls, the pleasure of the work itself, and above all, the increase of the Redeemer's kingdom are with me motives sufficient and more than sufficient to determine me to die in the work that I have undertaken. There's another, this is a Scottish man, a missionary named Alexander Duff. You may have heard the story. But we're going to go back now to Carey's dying day or days. And by the way, this has been reupholstered since Carey's day. They sent this to some place in America, some school, and they saw that it was pretty tattered, and they decided to reupholster it, which was not the desire of the people that sent it. I don't know if it was this library. I'm not sure who owned this. But anyway, that's not the cloth that was on it in Carey's day, if you're interested. But here's Alexander Duff. He was a missionary. He focused a lot in the area of education, and not as much as Carey on church planting and training nationals, that sort of thing. But he was talking, and Carey said this to him. You've probably heard this. Mr. Duff, you have been speaking about Dr. Carey. When I am gone, say nothing about Dr. Carey. Speak about Dr. Carey's Savior. So what's on his tombstone? It's there in, he's buried there in Serampore. And you can see Ashish on the left there looking at it. And this is what it says: a wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall. And he got some of that terminology from Isaac Watts' hymns. He really loved Isaac Watts and his hymns. And actually, John Newton was from Olney and William Cooper, and they published some hymns, the Olney hymn book that Carey really appreciated. So as we summarize his philosophy, here are the points. This is what he believed, and frankly, I don't think we can improve on this as we apply missions in a modern setting. The dissemination of the gospel by every feasible means. Bible distribution in the language of the people to enhance awareness of the gospel. Establishment of churches at the earliest moment possible. In-depth study of the background and thought of the non-Christian recipient peoples. Think about what he's saying there. He's saying it's important for us to understand how they think. And so they actually translated some, I guess they would be considered like Hindu epics. He wanted to understand the thinking and provision for early indigenous leadership training. So I don't think we can improve much on his philosophy of missions. All right, I will close with this. He says, to do good is the greatest honor of man, and to persevere in doing good in the midst of discouragement. Have you been there? He had many opportunities for discouragement. Of course, they had a fire that destroyed some of their manuscripts, destroyed some of their equipment. Of course, his wife, he had some discouragements later when some newer missionaries came and there was a division. And I'm not putting all the blame on them, but Carey was kind of the peacemaker. Anyway, doing good in the midst of discouragement is what will give you more happiness and ensure you greater respect than a crown would do. All right, so the rest of the PowerPoint, if you want to look at it later, is really just more about India today and its needs, which are still huge and great, over 1 billion people. Still a very Hindu place. Also, sections of it have millions and millions of Muslims. Okay, so I think that's about it.
Excellent. Thank you. The PowerPoint we will plan to put in that same Dropbox folder, so if you want to pull it out of there. Really encourage you, if you didn't already do the reading, take a look at it. Dr. Patterson, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I found really striking, of course, the reading is before he goes, so he's just forming a vision without ever really being on the field, without experiencing things. but striking to me was how, quote, progressive in the sense of forward thinking it was. Even I expected to see a lot of civilizing, we're going to civilize the heathen kind of a viewpoint, which I'm not an early 19th century expert, but it's just, that's what I expected to hear. And it wasn't really that simple of a view. Like, we're bringing them wisdom to teach them. There was a little bit of a bigger missiological view, it seemed, which I think is good. A language learning by mingling with people. There's a quote here: they must be very careful not to resent injuries which may be offered to them, nor to think highly of themselves so as to despise the poor heathens, and by those means lay down a foundation for their resentment. And then, if I understand it right, correct me if I'm wrong, Carey basically invented the organizational innovation of a mission board, and what we think of as kind of a group effort to be able to make this happen. Is that right? Is Carey essentially credited with this organizational way of viewing it?
Well, you've had several things there. I'll start with the last one. My understanding is Carey was not necessarily so much an administrator. I think Andrew Fuller would probably be credited with making the administrative aspect work. He was designated as what they call the secretary. Basically, I think he oversaw the finances and the communications. So I would probably give a lot of credit to Fuller on that level. Fuller was really on the same page with Carey as far as his burden. He just wasn't sure, that they had the money or the personnel or the know-how to do a mission board. So I would think Fuller had a lot to do with that. As far as Carey's forward thinking, yes, I'm amazed at those last 5 points. I can't improve on that. I mean, that's really what we want to do these days as well. And he did one other thing. I read a list of like 11 resolutions they had for their Serampore group. And one of those was to treat and consider the Indians on an absolute equal level with themselves. And they insisted from the very beginning that caste would not enter their church. And so they would not allow any evidence of caste in their Lord's Supper or in the way they did their seating in their church. They opposed that from the very beginning, which was obviously a wise move. So good observations there.
And the idea of, during this era, it's just, we've been talking about history and differences of moral expectations across long swaths of history. The idea of, in this era, a British citizen going abroad to a place like this and assuming that he is equal with the people when he arrives. This is not in vogue. It's not pretty, but that's not the way that, as I understand it, most people are going to think about themselves at this point. To go in with that vision is really countercultural to his day. It's pretty amazing, pretty impressive.
It is. It really is. And Britain ruled the Indian people. So his attitude was one, I would just say, of utter humility and respect. And that's what we need. He sets an example really in just about every way. Even I mentioned his peacemaking role. When the schism happened, actually it was his nephew who was one of those who came over. There was fault on both sides, but the criticisms were not of William Carey. Criticisms were mainly of Marshman and Ward, and Marshman in particular. But I think they were unjustified. But anyway, Carey was always one to see the good in people. So another example for us to follow there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. We will look forward to hearing from you again next time. There is another reading in the Dropbox for the next lecture, so make sure you take a look at that. It's a shorter reading, but I think you'll enjoy that as well. Dr. Patterson, thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you.
Okay, you're welcome. And if they have questions, they could send those to you and you can give them to me.
Perfect. Will do. Yes, please do. Just email me directly or on the Moodle page. Okay, good evening or good day to all. We'll see you later on.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.